I gave this title to my fellow core faculty last year, Extinction and Reproductive Choice, because two of my deepest interests in human beings, one, what are we like, where did we come from, and the other is what the relationship of population growth and overpopulation might be to the future of our species. And probably I'm interested in both of those things because I really like being a human, and I like other humans a lot too. And I don't know how to be anything else. And I'm also a kind of person who's really nostalgic. I love the people I've known in the past, and I'm sad when they leave, and I try to remember them. But then there are always new, wonderful people who come along to help you make the past and so forth feel better to you, because you know, and I think as I've gotten older, I've gotten more comfortable with the idea that your offspring, and perhaps more than your offspring, perhaps also the people you love, are the ones who help you to carry on being a human being. But studying humans is, I think, a really worthwhile thing to do. There are some things. For example, I will talk about reproductive choice, and it's not like I have the answers. Why humans behave the way they do in terms of the number of children they decide to have and when and so forth is kind of a mystery. I have good friends that I love who have had 5 children, and I was married once before, and it was a point sort of that with my first wife I had 2 children, with my second wife I had 1. And so I say in terms of zero population growth, 3 people made 3 people. And that wasn't insignificant to me. Yet in members of my family who decided to have large families, I really didn't feel that I could say to them, why do you have so many children? So I've reflected on that a good deal too. Why is it that when we believe something is important possibly for the future of humans, that those we love and those who we consider intelligent and concerned about the planet nonetheless do the thing that it seems is in some ways disregarding of the planet. Of course, when I mentioned this to my mother, she said, which of my 4 children would you rather I didn't have? And I said, no, that's not the point, Mom. It's if you've already had them, you're not going to wish them away. But if you've never had them, maybe you wouldn't know what they'd be like. So anyway, I titled this Extinction and Reproductive Choice, and it's going to be something of a struggle to hook the two things together. But as I say, the 2 topics were ones that mean a lot to me, and so I wanted to speak about them with you. Talk a little bit about reproductive choice, so I title this Population Pressure. Population increase causes resource scarcity. Duh, right? I mean, it's so obvious. Perhaps I didn't need to say it. And then, what are the human responses to population pressure? Well, we're cultural creatures. And I'm sure if you've been around me in either of my classes, you've heard me talk about how remarkable it is that we are capable of culture. I sort of confused my anthropology class in the midterm by asking them what the relationship between genes and culture was. And it was kind of a dumb question on the one hand because it's confusing, but it also was pointed in that I wanted them to think, well, genes don't predict culture. No matter what culture you grow up in, you'll learn that culture. So what genes give us is the capacity for culture. And not only, I mean, culture then you can think of as whatever it is that we learn, and that's how we operate to communicate with others, to understand our world, to make plans for the future, even to think about thinking, things that our brains make it possible for us to do. And as far as we know, there is no other species that does that to the extent that we do. We know that chimpanzees are capable. Actually, there's I think that Lucy is not a chimp. I forget whether she's but she was I believe, an ape who was able to communicate through computer use at about the level of a 3-year-old. And we know that chimps in the wild make tools to get termites out of termite mounds. And so, as I've often said, that as they break that twig to insert it in the termite mound, that is no longer a twig, it's a termite getter. So really, they've made a symbolic transformation, which is what language is. We're able to fashion symbols that allow us to think about things even when we're not near them, and hence to create language and to communicate with each other. So all of our responses, as far as we know, this is one thing that I accept. Modern Homo sapiens, dates from somewhere between 60 and 100,000 years. There is an archaic Homo who didn't apparently have some of the mental capacity that we did, even though the anatomy of archaic Homo is very similar to modern. And I accept that that is the lineage of the two forms of Homo sapiens. Archaic Homo made tools and knew how to control fire, which is a big step, but some other hominids knew that as well. So by the time modern Homo comes around, suddenly there's a tremendous increase in the number and kinds of artifacts that are found in the archaeological record. So how did humans, Homo sapiens, respond to the perception of population pressure? Their resources got more scarce. They had to work harder to get the same amount of food. They might have had to walk farther to find foods. So they had 3 choices. They could either intensify production, either work harder, or invent new technologies. But we know that Homo sapiens exploited wild resources from that time period, maybe 60,000 years ago, until in some parts of the world, almost the present. It's pretty unusual now to still find people who live by hunting and gathering, although in some parts of the world they may do it some, but they also operate in cash economies. And so among the new technologies that they used was farming. Farming is a technology because it is a human invention whereby through understanding things like plant germination, the need for water, soils, plant spacing, domestication of seeds, and a whole series of things that go into farming, or gardening if you want to call it that, they could take the same amount of area and produce more food on it. They might have to put in more energy, but they got more energy out. And over time, humans devised ever more energy-intensive technologies and to produce more and more food. And if you measure only human energy, the amount of energy put into modern industrial farming is very insignificant. Human calories, or BTUs, if you use the British system, are pretty scant. One person can grow, can cultivate, harvest, plant thousands of bushels of corn. But on the other hand, it's probably well known by all of you that it takes like 10 calories of petroleum energy to produce 1 calorie of food. So ironically, we can't eat petroleum because if we could, we'd get 10 times the energy advantage from it. Of course, as Molly was saying in her lecture last week, this is one of the things we worry about, the fact that modern farming is so energy dependent and that it has a lot of potentially negative consequences. So B, we could take over new territory. This probably, given a certain technology, I was reading an article the other day where the author was asserting that early Homo sapiens and the spread out of Africa across Asia into Australia, throughout Europe and so forth, that they had to be really warlike and aggressive because they were encountering Neanderthal, Homo neanderthalis, as they went. But my sense is that, of course, we have the potential to be aggressive and warlike ourselves. But once that boundary of humans had reached territory and taken it over, chances are they would have behaved a lot like contemporary hunter-gatherers do, which is they have egalitarian access based on kinship to the resources that are needed in order to survive. And so that as a rule, the kind of violence they experience is principally because of jealousy, competition within the group. Keep that in mind if you read books that emphasize that humans in the past were more warlike and aggressive, and that civilization, as they call it, came because of adaptation, possibly psychological adaptation to become more peaceful, which I can hardly imagine myself if you think of the power that emperors and kings had to execute people, to conscript people into armies, take them away from their families, slaughter each other on the battlefield. It doesn't seem to me that modern humans are any less aggressive or bloodthirsty. And in fact, oftentimes it also seems that the leaders who take their people into battle are lacking in a personality trait that we all value, which is empathy. They don't empathize with their soldiers or their soldiers' families and so forth. So today, the options of taking over new territory, perhaps one of the most remarkable examples of that would be colonization of North and South America, and then other parts of the world which are inhabited by hunter-gatherers, where their technologies required them to utilize vast tracts of land, and such as the Kung in southern Africa now have grazing cattle on their lands, and they've been herded into reservations as the native peoples of North America were. So that's less of an option. But nonetheless, when humans decide to do it, it is a cultural phenomenon. They don't just wander off. They make plans. They communicate with their social groups. So in other words, I suppose that any species could invade other territory, but they wouldn't do it for the same reasons or with the same reasoning, I guess, that Homo sapiens would. And then finally, C, they could limit or decrease population. And one of the things that has surprised me about that, I think the last serious discussion of family planning, population control, and so forth in the United States was back in the 1960s. Since that time, some NGOs try to keep family planning, population control, and so forth on the agenda, but it's become one of those highly contested areas where, since, for example, half of the population growth of the United States is from immigration, that people perceive anti-immigration forces to be all either racist or chauvinist or unsympathetic to those who need and so forth. But it's true that if the population of the United States increases at a rate faster than any other developed nation, it will be because we are one of 3 countries that allow significant amounts of immigration: United States, Canada, and Australia. The next chart is just a graph showing farther back than what we think of as archaic Homo, but up until the present, and this is probably very familiar to you, when population increases, as it has off to the right there, it had to be because food production technology was able to capture and apply more energy. So the unbelievable amount of energy that was liberated through the beginning of the use of fossil fuels made possible this enormous climb. What you will see is that on that graph, from the far left to the far right, where it starts up in the air, And I could say, actually, to the point on that graph that is within the last 50 years, that there are now more people alive than there were in the entire rest of that history. And so that you would say that culture has made us phenomenally successful. It's just that the word successful makes us a little nervous because we're wondering if that success also spells our doom. Oops. Now, I'm just going to give 3 examples of when humans experience population pressure, what they do about it. And as I say, to a certain extent, we can take hunting-gathering groups that have been studied in the present as examples of what people were like in the past. I perhaps believed more strongly a year ago that the human brain hadn't changed much in the last 60,000 years. I'd still put that out there as a hypothesis. But we have seen a limited amount of speciation among humans, and at least we know we developed different skin colors in different climates. But the gene complexes responsible for skin color are not the same gene complexes that are responsible for many, many, if not all of our other characteristics. And it's yet to be shown that culture in any way is reflective of specific gene pools. So the Kung, these people who lived in small bands, depending on the nature of their ecology, the ones that I am most familiar with, the Kung San, lived in groups of about 15 in a very arid part of the Kalahari. Yet they knew 90 species of edible plants and lived a life where they basically only had to work maybe, I believe it was 2 days a week to assure a reasonably comfortable subsistence. 75%, maybe 80% of their calories did come from one source, the mongongo nut, which is high in protein, calories, carbohydrate, and so forth. A pretty neat food. But on the other hand, they got variety, taste, texture, and so forth from other plants, the other 89 plants that they took advantage of in their environment. They walked up to 2,000 miles a year. And so because of this very low-fat diet and the high amount of exercise, normally women would be carrying one child during those gathering trips. They got what is called lactational amenorrhea, and which we can also get from exercise. And that means that it disrupts the ovulation cycle because there's not enough fat in the body to allow ovulation to occur. In America today, long-distance female runners often stop having their periods, stop ovulating, because they don't have enough body fat to do so. So this, it's hard to say to exactly what extent this may have inhibited fertilization or pregnancy. They did also have postpartum sex taboos for a certain period of time, usually a year after the birth. They wouldn't have sex at all. And they also practiced abortion and infanticide. Migration for them was impractical because on the boundaries of every group's territory, there were more distant relatives who were already occupying those lands. And yet, if you had kin, they would share resources with you if times got hard. Population policy, if you want to call it that, how many children should I have? Well, you shouldn't have probably more than one birth every 5 years, because if you did, there would be times you'd be carrying 2 children, and which was simply not possible for them. And so it's not totally known, and I'm quite interested to know more about this. I have done a fair amount of looking in the past to see who says, you know, this baby shouldn't survive if a birth happens. But my inclination from the reading is that it was more of a communal pressure to conform, but also people knew what the consequences were of having a child too soon, because they lived in the only ecology that they could exploit. You know, that if they had too many people and they ate too much of the available food, they would know it, because there wouldn't be anywhere else for them to get food, except, as I say, sometimes in the dry time they would run out of bitter melons. There's a really neat film you should see sometime called Bitter Melons. And during the dry times, the only water that they got in their mouths came from these melons, which didn't, when you squeezed them, you barely got a dribble or so of water. So it was simply by eating large quantities of the melon that they could get the water that they needed in the dry times. The second example of Western Europe, I think, is fairly dramatic. In part, the 12th to 19th centuries was a time of a lot of violence, and out of that violence, as we've had others in the core course lecture series say, came ideas about evolution, competition, and so forth. We had a lot of urbanization, peasants being forced off the land, either because the landlords turned to raising sheep and they wanted the common lands for themselves, or because families, there was a decline in mortality, and the large families that people were having couldn't all be supported on the small plots of land they had, and so they flocked to the cities. The cities became places of incredible poverty, disease, and premature death. Child labor contributed to that as well. In 1348, the Black Death, bubonic plague, caused up to 50% mortality in England, and probably not quite that in some other parts of Europe. Abortion and infanticide were common. One of the practices was called overlaying, where the Christian faith had spread a lot in Europe, and the Christians were opposed to infanticide. And but if a mother nursed her child and inadvertently lay on top of it and suffocated it, they wouldn't be accused of murdering the child. But this was according to parish records, which have been studied by historical demographers. There were many, many such cases of what they call overlaying during that time period. Also, foundlings, who were abandoned children, instead of taking them out and just leaving them in a field or in the woods or some such thing, which certainly had been also the practice, they would take them to foundling houses, which were either churches or like orphanages, except that 80 to 90% of the people, the children, infants, taken to those foundling houses died within the first year. And people knew this. They knew that, you know, it wasn't like the guarantee that their infant would survive. Some did, but most didn't. By the 19th century, as many as 100,000 infants were abandoned per year. So migration to the New World was a big draw, and for these people who were coming out of the poverty of Europe, the opportunity to expand into an environment where the technology that they had of agriculture, horsepower, and so forth, the beginnings of steam power, use of coal, and so on, made it possible to have large families and to prosper in the New World. In the contemporary USA, you might say we have no governmental population policy. If there is a population policy, that policy is to have children, because during the Nixon administration, they did actually do a plan. The National Security Council produced a plan that was called Domestic or International Security in the face of population growth. The report took 2 years to complete, and when it was completed, it was never published. A lot of pressure by both the Christian right and the Church in Rome suppressed the publication, and nothing, as far as I know, was ever done with the report. It took several years and requests under the Freedom of Information Act to even read it. In spite of that, there are many, many American Catholics and other religious sects who ignore what you might call the NGO, the non-governmental organization, but which in some cases acts like a governmental organization, and use birth control devices in order to space or limit the number of offspring they have. For those who are more under the influence of their religious authorities, there is more or less opportunity to to use, for example, anything that isn't simply against conception, anything that interferes with the implantation of the ovum or causes the ovum to be expelled once it's fertilized, they're opposed to. Also, sterilization, they would be opposed to as well. In spite of that, there are many technologies that we've developed to prevent conception. And it should be added that even in ancient times, some plants were known to cause abortion and were used. When I mentioned earlier about the Kung or medieval Europe, there were, I can't remember the genus, but there's a genus of plants that dill and cumin and some of those others like Queen Anne's lace and so forth will, in addition to having health benefits in certain doses, will produce an abortion. We have individualistic ideologies about family size, and there's little discussion. As I mentioned, I've tried to discuss this. You would think that in your family, you have the most intimate group and the greatest opportunity to, to discuss things like what's our obligation. My sense is that many, many people who have two children because they don't think they can afford to have more. But I hope that they also might be thinking that they're not contributing to the increase in population pressure. But it basically, one of my siblings who had 4 children said, "It's none of your business." And so, okay, it's none of my business. And so I don't know really if I think that there are many governments in the world, in the developing countries, who have family planning programs. Often these are criticized. China's one-child plan. I think it's a really good example of a family planning program where people get indignant, morally indignant. How can they tell people how many children to have? If the Philippines, 2 or 3 years, I think 2007, similarly tried to get a model family size of 2 and to create a family planning program which would encourage the use of contraceptives but would also fund abortions, and the entire program was torpedoed by lobbying from the church in Rome. So it's very difficult in the climate that we live in today, and probably you all have wondered, what's the motivation for this when the need for population control is so important? What's the motivation for discouraging people from limiting their family size? That's none of my business, I guess. Of course, I wanted to say who experiences population pressure, and this is just to reify a little bit what I said before. They don't have any imports, almost no cultivation, and they have direct experience of fluctuations in abundance. In pre-industrial Western Europe, rapid growth of cities, disconnection of poor from the land. They certainly perceived it because people starved to death. I read in the process of researching this that during that time, one of the most common crimes was theft, and that I think it was in a certain decade in the 18th century in London, something on the order of 5,000 people were hanged for stealing sums of money. So life was cheap because there was so much of it. And I don't think I put this elsewhere in my talk, but I've always wondered if, if there isn't some cynicism on the part of the elites to increase population to keep the labor supply big and wages down, I've never read that that's a part of anyone's thinking, but it certainly is one of the effects of keeping population growing. In the contemporary USA, we are disconnected from our subsistence by world markets. And if you have enough power and enough money, you can buy anybody's food. And in fact, we do. Now they've got imported asparagus from Peru, which likely most of the Peruvian people can't afford to buy. And we get shrimp from all over the world, which people used to eat before there was a world market for it, and now they can't afford to buy it either. So we don't see the land or the people who grow the food. And how do we change this? Well, there is an agrarian movement afoot, farmers markets and so forth, where people are trying to become more aware of this food system that puts food on their plates. And I would suppose that, thinking back to Molly's talk of what we can do is we need to learn about our food system. How many people can the Earth support? This was pretty amazing. There's a great book by Joel Cohen called How Many People Can the Earth Support? And he's a mathematician who works at Rockefeller University, also a comedian, does stand-up comedy. A really brilliant guy, and instead of having a sort of political axe to grind, he tried to sort of review the history and the math of how people figured out how many people the Earth could support. Rich?
There was a very good article by him yesterday in the New York Times on reaching 7 billion.
Is that right? Yeah, I'll have to look for it. I'll give you a chance after I finish rambling up here to tell us about it, if you can, yeah.
I'd rather have you read it.
Okay. So amazingly, the estimates range from 1 billion, in which case we're already way over the hill, to 1,000 billion. And some of the scenarios that the authors of the really high 100 billion or so forth, they were imagining most of the cultivable land of the Earth in either algae or corn, and all of the population of the Earth living in either on platforms in the ocean or on buildings that were roughly 70 stories high on less arable land on Earth. So the thing that they weren't addressing is quality of life. And I think even for us, if you've visited places where the population density is over 1,000 persons per square kilometer, you feel crowded. I might add that I think later in the talk, I talk about human adaptation. Maybe one of the ways we'll evolve is to be able to tolerate. The ones who can tolerate that will survive, and the ones who don't will commit suicide. Okay, so over half of the estimates were between 4 billion and 16 billion. And the high estimate for 2050 from the UN is 10.5 billion. I believe that's not the conservative projection. But one of the things that Cohen points out that's really important, I think, is what happens in the future isn't known. And therefore, you can't say what the population will be. So that's why it's so uncertain. And one of the great things about that book, I think, his conclusion, reaching ZPG, zero population growth, is inevitable. We will reach ZPG at some time. But we just don't know when or where. And one of the things that he says is that ZPG may be reached, say, South America, while it's still growing in North America, and then it'll change. He said it won't be one static picture for the entire Earth. Some places may become the places everyone migrates to. Certainly human migration is a big issue in the present time, both for changing demands on planning, but also for the spread of disease. As urbanization has progressed, it creates a much better opportunity for diseases to evolve as well. Extinction, as was said in, I guess it was at your talk, Rich, said was a radical idea in the 18th century, or it might have been Catherine's talk, where the person was saying that it was considered anti-Christian to think that anything could go extinct. How could it be? It wasn't. If God had made it, how could God possibly let it go extinct? But we've come to realize that extinction is an ongoing process, though it is believed that the rate of extinction has greatly increased in the last, since the fossil fuel revolution began. 99% of all species which have ever lived are now extinct. Pretty staggering to think of, and most of them we haven't got the foggiest idea about. Many things that went extinct probably haven't been discovered. But this is part of natural history, I guess, or reality that I find hardest. As I said before, I hate for things to change. And so the idea that 99% of everything that ever was has gone extinct, pretty hard for me to accept. But I'm hoping that out of understanding myself and why I'm a great denier, that things are going bad and I can deny it. Well, that may be a human trait that I ought to try and learn more about, because maybe that's why people don't get more worked up about the population boom in the earth and the possible Armageddon that might come as a result of it. In terms of extinctions, we know that one, at least, massive extinction happened at the end of the age of dinosaurs, but that very extinction opened the way for the evolution of most of the creatures that we know on Earth today. Probably caused by one thing, an asteroid impact with the Earth, which set off a series of events that cooled the Earth and caused many plants to stop growing, and consequently the things that needed the warmth and needed that vegetation died off. Cultural change versus biological change. People often ask, well, what's the difference? Why do humans seem like they're not a part of nature? I think one of the major reasons is that the things that we do in nature oftentimes require other species to adapt biologically, whereas we adapt to them culturally, and we can do so oftentimes, or at least we think we can, quickly. But most species don't have the opportunity to adapt quickly. Those that do seem to be capable of learning, like seagulls are capable of learning where new food sources are. But those that aren't capable of learning oftentimes can't respond as quickly as we can create the change. So, hominid extinctions. Again, just in the recent past, a conservative Christian asked me to show them any evidence of, something that antedated, or rather predated humans. So I did show him the graph, and I showed him some pictures of fossil remains, but those things don't seem to make much of a dent on people who don't want to believe them. I think I have let me finish this page. Homo sapiens may have overlapped with 3 other hominid species, Homo heidelbergensis, which may have migrated out of Africa 800,000 years ago, Homo neanderthalensis, which may have evolved from Homo heidelbergensis, and there was a remnant population of Homo erectus that was discovered in the last 15 years or so in Java, a diminutive version of it, as if they'd become sort of miniaturized, or about 3 feet tall, but which undoubtedly 30,000 years prior is what they date the remains to, and Homo sapiens was spreading into Australia by 30,000 years ago. There is, in the migration of Homo sapiens and its encounter with Neanderthal, recent evidence has shown that there was some mixing of Neanderthal genes with Homo sapiens genes. But there is none of that found in Africa, which seems to confirm the idea that they met Neanderthal outside of Africa and may have mixed some with them there. That they were smart and culturally capable is indicated by the fact that to reach Australia, sea levels were about 350 feet lower at the time, but they still had to sail 90 miles from Southeast Asia to New Guinea. So they had figured out how to, by 30,000 years ago, to make boats and sail, or maybe row. Can you see the writing on that at all? This is a graph, a time graph, that shows 15 of the extinct, or 14, 15th is Homo sapiens, and suggests that there's a line that's kind of leading up the top towards Homo sapiens. There are other species. I think there are 20-odd named species now. This is 15 of them, going back about 4.5 million years. To a species I know almost nothing about, Ardipithecus ramidus. You probably have heard more of Australopithecus africanus, the fourth blue line. Notice one of the key things is the shape of the skulls. That's one, and I'm always impressed. We used to have a physiologist here, Butch Rommel, who could look at a bone and instantly tell what kind of an animal it came from, where the bone was from in the body, and so forth. And one of the neat reasons for studying physiology, I think, is that, and it makes possible some of the some of the paleontologists who do artistic recreations must know a great deal about anatomy and physiology, because by knowing, for example, a brow ridge or a crest on the head would have to do with the muscles that operate the jaw. So there is a species I'll show you an artist rendering of that probably ate largely a vegetarian diet because it had these massive muscles for making their jaws chomp on them. Of course, they would find that their teeth were modeled for chewing vegetation as well. Up to the left, I think another thing about this chart that's interesting, you see that Homo erectus, the bar nearest the right that's longest, but which doesn't appear to be connected to us in any way, it lived, for as far as we can see, over 1 million years. That's a long time. Even though I have really no notion of what 1 million years is, I do know it's a long time. And certainly a lot longer than Homo sapiens. Modern Homo has been around, maybe maximum 100,000 years. So something about Homo erectus, which lived, overlapped with Ergaster and Heidelbergensis, something about it was extremely well adapted. And Homo erectus did go out of Africa 1 million years ago and populated Europe, but undoubtedly fell victim to the Neanderthals, or likely fell victim to the Neanderthals or Homo heidelbergensis. And that raises a point which I think I have in here somewhere, which I'll see if it comes up, which is how can we conceive of the kind of environment in which reproductive isolation makes speciation possible? Because it's been very difficult for me to wrap my mind around the idea that these distinct species evolved in Africa. How is it that a species can become distinct? And I think one of the keys is reproductive isolation. And so that's a question that we might apply to ourselves. What possibility is it that we would evolve lacking that reproductive isolation? Or could we describe in some ways any reproductive isolation that might exist today? This is kind of difficult to sequence, the location of this slide, so I just put it here anyway. Will overpopulation cause human extinction? It's kind of wrapping up the first part. Other species are more likely, I think, to go extinct because of human expansion. That at least for the large animals that we find we're most drawn to through loss of habitat, because of us expanding into their territories, converting their territories to farmland or homes. one of the things that's happened in China that is surprising, really, as China made such great strides in stopping population growth, is that they now have converted a lot of their farmland to industrial land. So the question is raised by some current resource economists, where will China get the food to make up for the farmland that they've lost? And as mentioned before, there have been episodes of major human population decline, for example, bubonic plague, smallpox, influenza, and the possibility that new pandemic diseases, swine flu, bird flu, the different kinds of influenza, which if they reach the stage of being able to be communicated through the air, could, according to the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, could wipe out up to 50% of the current global population, which would be certainly a staggering number of people, 3.5 billion people. But at the same time, that would mean 3.5 billion would survive. And that was why I began to think, well, of all of the things that could cause extinction, most of the things that we've experienced in the last 300 years, well, even 1,000 years, haven't managed to really threaten the continued existence of humans. It's said that there might have been 50 million Native Americans at the time of the European conquest, and that maybe 80% of them died of violence or European diseases. But still, 80% of 50 million is only 40 million, so there were probably, if that were the case, 10 million left. Here's an artist's rendition of certain species. This is Australopithecus afarensis. I should have made this so that we could keep the slides projected together up there. Africanus, this is the one, the fossil Lucy, so-called, about 3 million years old. Homo heidelbergensis, this is the one that migrated out of Africa around 800,000 years ago. Floresiensis, discovered in Europe and thought to be an offshoot of either Neanderthal or Neanderthal in combination with another species. Homo erectus, the Homo hominid that a remnant population was found. Again, this would take animal physiology to know what the shapes of the faces would be like. We don't, of course, know how much hair they had or what their skin color was. But nonetheless, I believe that the way flesh is put on their bodies is probably reasonably accurate. Parnthropus Boisei is the one who I was saying was a vegetarian that I mentioned earlier. Okay, other possible causes of Homo sapiens extinction: major asteroid strike, new hominid predator, e.g. a subspecies without empathy. One would suspect that if there were a subspecies of humans that didn't have empathy, chances are they'd want us empathic types around so they could exploit us. I don't know. But, whether you could actually develop a subspecies that had no empathy. Attack by aliens, that's always a good possibility. A sterility epidemic or a bioterrorist attack which would cause sterility, or more virulent viruses aided by increased population density. And then there's room for your ideas. I actually would be quite curious what your ideas are that might cause Homo sapiens to go extinct. And here's where I think that it was important to read something like The World Without Us. The World Without Us, for me, did a couple of things. One was it made me so aware of how resilient the Earth is, particularly the chapter on Chernobyl, where they talked about how many species have re-inhabited it other than humans. And it's not to say that they love it or that it's not hard for them or whatever, but apparently they seem to be doing well. They're birds, mammals, and so forth. Also, how quickly natural processes can reclaim, as in the chapter on Cyprus, where the buildings have trees growing, the sidewalks and streets are, being reclaimed by plants, and windows are broken and birds have moved into the buildings and so forth. I think, of course, I've often said this, that if you want to think about the resilience of the Earth, imagine Bar Harbor, Maine with 3 miles of ice on top of it, slowly moving into the Atlantic Ocean. And you look out the window now, maybe 6,000 years later, and you wouldn't believe it had happened. Humans have some wonderful qualities, and this is, I get to the part where I also say why I think we should survive. And if John says that he wants the birds on Duck Island to survive because he likes them, I could say I want humans to survive because I like them. I like myself, I guess. Art, language, poetry, music, love in its several forms, sexual pleasure and bonding with a mate, forgiveness, empathy, delight in the senses, beauty, loyalty, and others, which you might add. We can not only experience directly the best of our species, the pleasures of food, the completion and forgiveness of love, the transcendence of sex, the passion, playfulness, and enlightenment of the arts, the expansion of the self into the spirit, but we can also contemplate, remember, and reify the experience as well. I say, yes, I want us to persevere, preserve, and persist. And so I'm going to read you Elizabeth Barrett Browning's most famous love poem for her husband, Robert Browning. Just an example of both poetry and language, in that just hearing the words, at least when I first heard this poem read, it made me realize what a delight it is to be a human being. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach when feeling out of sight for the ends of being and ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life, and if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. I think that's an amazing thought, that you could go on loving after death. This is an 11,000-year-old figurine. I had a soundtrack for the last 4 slides, but I couldn't get it to work. So, 11,000-year-old figurine found in the Middle East of a loving couple. It might give you some ideas of a new embrace, a position of embrace. And 3 paintings by Albert Bierstadt, who, when I originally did these, if I clicked on the little icon in the middle, it would play songs, but I couldn't get it to work, so I'm sorry. Let's see. These are very romantic to me, very romantic paintings, filled with larger-than-life feelings for the natural world, and probably they convey a lot of cultural information, which I'll ignore because I just like the paintings. And, they talk about how 19th, early 20th century people thought of nature, and so there's an interpretation about that in these paintings. And these are some ants, and there was a good soundtrack that went with that too. It went, and I thought, I just can't get into that music. So I'll take any questions. But, it could be that's the future, so as Kent Brockman in The Simpsons said, I'm ready to accept our new overlords. And all right, thank you. It's so much isn't it? I mean, it's so much. It's just touching the surface of so many things. But it's sort of my idea of what human ecology is. There's paleontology, there's art, there's anthropology, there's the cultures of the world, the languages of the world, so forth, and what they mean to different people, and what we're like, what our brains are like, human physiology, evolutionary psychology. And I wish I had another lifetime to, get even more deeply into those things. So I don't intend to have offered you the answer to anything, but rather a piece of a love affair, I guess, with human beings. So I'd be happy to try and answer any questions if there were any. Yeah.
So population control is really interesting, but culture isn't factored into it very often. And I've noticed that, I've read an article about how in certain Asiatic cultures, they have instituted population control in families, and therefore there's like supposedly 1 million girls missing because families will choose to abort children which are female because it's more desirable to have a male in that culture.
Right. Right. The question is, and I tried, but apparently not too successfully, to say that most of the human solutions to the perception of environmental pressure or population pressure are cultural responses. Why did the Chinese, for example, choose to abort or kill female children? And they developed a litany of aphorisms that said, for example, girls are worthless. It's better to raise geese than girls. I mean, if you've read the book The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston, that she explores that because she's Chinese American and her mother tells her these things, and she's trying to figure out, wait a minute, I'm in this American culture where they don't say that. Why is my mother saying this? And but one of the cultural ecological explanations is that it is a much more effective suppression of population growth to eliminate females than it is males. And that the likely thing, one of the things that often isn't pointed out, that they didn't say that about older women. In China, when it was a peasant farming system, they had what they call a patrilocal postmarital residence, and women, when they married, went to their husband's farm and lived, and came under the direction of the mother-in-law. The mother-in-law directed household work. So to marry someone was to get an extra worker. And the mother had a lot of prestige and power. And it's not unlike other cultures in which younger women are put in a very subordinate position. So female infanticide is probably the most common form of infanticide among people where the question of rapid population growth, population suppression, a specific type of economy, and like in the United States, it wouldn't make any difference, hardly, because both men and women lead productive lives earning money. So in terms, and we don't practice postmarital or postmarital residence that's either matrilocal or patrilocal. But people have invented very peculiar customs, and sometimes with things like female infanticide, you could say they do relate to the population needs of the culture. I'm not sure that Maxine Hong ever felt better about her childhood. I mean, you can read that book and see whether you would feel better. Yeah?
Two things. First off, in response to the issues around the cultural connection between infanticide. First off, pretty sure you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that culturally it would have mainly been the male is doing the field work, which would have had an impact in the whole situation of you're going to want more field workers, which is kind of a big deal in an agricultural society. Second off, you asked more ideas on on another idea for how we can go extinct. I had a kind of crazy one.
Go for it.
Okay, so based on the fact that the virus is at base level an alien system that changes our systems normally to reproduce itself. What about a virus that redefines the being that it's in without killing it?
Well, I don't know. but it's an interesting sci-fi topic.
If our genetics were to be altered beyond what we would accept as being human, that could be an extinction of humanity without being an extinction of the beings that inhabit the earth.
Right, right. Well, I'd be happy to collect other ideas for my eventual career as a science fiction writer. But thank you for that. You know, I don't want to keep you too long. I'm sorry about my phone. I'm just going to let it ring, since I don't know how to shut it off. So, I usually wait for the battery to go dead. Thank you. In terms of the reason for female infanticide, that a culture very often with things that are difficult appeals to a higher authority or to something. I think many cultures say, well, we're killing girls because we don't want more people. You know, that it wasn't that population growth and the mechanisms for it are not things that people tend to verbalize as the reasons for doing things. In fact, I mean, this is another characteristic of humans, to give multiple answers for the things we think and do, and to change from day to day almost sometimes as to, because we often have multiple reasons. I think it occurred to me when I was a teenager that it might be good to be dishonest sometimes, because when your girlfriend asks you, do you really love me? You know, maybe you should lie, because you don't really know whether you do or not. I guess I could have been smarter and just said, I don't know, but it doesn't seem like that would have been a satisfactory answer either. Oftentimes we don't know what we think. So anyway, the Chinese perpetuated this system by denigrating girls. Right? That was the sort of aphorisms in their culture. But one of the points was, or one of the ecological points was, that it resulted in suppressing population growth. Now, one could imagine that if you had some custom that instead of suppressing population growth had the opposite effect, that perhaps the culture would collapse. So it would be the persistence of culture traits that tend to make a culture collapse. It could be that the idea of progress and that we'll always be able to feed everyone who comes along through improved agriculture, that those are persistent ideas in our culture which will lead to collapse. It's very difficult to change those kinds of things once they become established. Yep.
I was kind of following the train of thought, and it seems to me that cultural anthropology and social psych definitely put the Asiatic cultures in being more collective and thinking more about the group, where Western societies are less prone to do that on an institutional and individual level. So I was wondering, you mentioned an ideology, American or Western ideology, for not dwelling on these issues. And I was wondering what you felt that ideology was.
Well, the ideology, I guess, of reproductive choice is it's none of my business. I mean, that is an ideology, right? That government or other entities outside of the family don't have a place in deciding how many children you should have. And I would say that that's an ideology. Yeah, Catherine?
We're dominated by a male ideology globally, and we don't have reproductive freedom in total in this country. And so I wonder, we're talking in general terms about culture and sort of abstracting this idea of female infanticide. Is there some solution that could happen between genders
I think that, you know, I've sometimes noted, it's kind of a long comment, but I've sometimes noted that when you say the world is suffering from overpopulation, that people from India or China might say, that's your point of view, you first worlders, when in fact you're having so much more of a negative impact on resources. But in fact, in those countries where you have the sale of girls, you know, you still have sexual slavery and forced prostitution and so forth, and male control. And I'm not saying we don't have male control of reproductive choices here. A lot of religious groups, men set the agenda in terms of what the family should be. But where women have gotten economic independence and have been able to control their own reproduction, they have fewer children. And yeah.
So is that a solution?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, to get men to accept that.
To one child,
Right.
we improve the situations that they're in, their reproductive freedoms around the world, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Rich.
On the topic of extinction that you brought up, if you look backwards in evolutionary history, I think virtually all mass extinctions have been catastrophic events that primarily change the climate
Right.
and kill things off.
Right.
And in contrast to the world without us, where we're gone but the rest of the living world stays on, there's a book by Cormac McCarthy called The Road, which I think is very close to what such a catastrophe would really be like with a few people left.
Mm.
I don't know if you've read it.
I haven't yet. Yeah.
It's really gripping.
It was a year ago on the bestseller list, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I sometimes think about that. You know how quickly people started shooting at each other when the gasoline disappeared from the pumps back in the 70s, and how quickly people panic and buy out grocery stores if there's some kind of hurricane coming or other. I mean, I just worry that it wouldn't take long for total anarchy to ensue if there was a disruption of, you know, food and energy. Yep.
I was wondering, because I've heard many times few biologists saying that, well, expressing this theory that we shouldn't worry that much about extinction because many of the diseases we're facing right now, they are a result of the overpopulation, meaning, for example, I don't know, cancer and like all these different diseases we have now, they're just a way of controlling population. And like by the end, they're going to be the solution. Like that's what actually limits population, in terms of like human population, of course. So I've heard many people saying, oh, you shouldn't worry. I mean, at the end, that's the limit we have. And like, it's quite effective. So I don't know.
That certainly could be, and the only thing I have to say about that is that I'm addicted to the idea that we might have some choice. You know, that if my brain is good for anything, maybe I ought to be able to make some choices that, you know, would prevent that from happening. But it can be, you know, another thing I think that is that a lot of people think we could be anywhere. One of the things about believing that God plunked us down here already, just like we are, is that we think we could be anywhere else. You know, if we don't think of ourselves as having come out of that long line of hominids to a point where we have this capacity for culture, this incredible brain, this apprehension of all those things that I said make both life possible and enjoyable for us, well, it would tend, if you believe that, it would tend to make you value the earth more, wouldn't it? I mean, God isn't going to pick us up and plunk us down somewhere else because we couldn't live anywhere else. This is it for us, you know. And so I really like to think of us as earthbound creatures. This is where we belong, and I'd like to think of us going on here, too. There was yeah.
There's also something else is that I feel that with our idea of development and progress, we might be also undermining ourselves, especially in relation to when you look at things that, for example, like people living in countries like here in the US or in some parts of Europe, and you have access to like pure clean water all the time, and you have like super clean facilities, and like your immune system doesn't develop as strongly as it does in countries where you have more contact with bacteria and things like that, which is why people get sick more easily when they go to developing countries or whatever. Like, if you have that in mind, that we're like surrounding ourselves with this bubble of cleanliness, quote unquote, and undermining our immune system, and the fact
I agree, and the only thing is that it's not going to cause all of us to disappear, you know. And as this fellow says, you know, it could be that it's just going to happen. But it'd be nice to think we had some influence over the future. Well, it's 10 of 4, and I don't want to keep you longer than you want. Gray.
There's a question. So you mentioned strategies that cultures have used to deal with resource scarcity that comes from increased population. 3 things. So increasing population size, changing the technology, and just conquering more territory. I'm wondering, it seems like there's a 4th strategy. It's very important, which is it's in principle to be adopted, which is to decide to consume less. To, you know, vegetables and meat, to have a smaller house, to drive less, you know, all these things that are actually proposed currently in the U.S. as one part of the strategy to deal with resource scarcity issues coming up. And I'm wondering, as an anthropologist, if you can think of any cultures around the world that have adopted that as a strategy at any point, or if you have any sort of insight from anthropology about who might adopt that and why and how, or if people resist it, why and how that is, and how that resistance comes to pass.
You know, many religious groups had monasteries and practiced celibacy and so forth. I think from my own point of view that to give up sex wouldn't be an improved quality of life, but it has a salutary effect on population control. And likewise, if we ate nothing but algae, you know, we could have an enormously larger population. But I'm not sure that would constitute improved quality of life either. I do think, though, at the same time, you're right in that all of us could consume less. Maybe not just the foods we eat, but you know, the things we buy and the energy we waste and so forth. So I guess that I would embrace conservation and consumption, reduction of consumption as ethics, but I wouldn't eliminate all pleasures. And it's not to say that one couldn't unlearn to think that driving your car around when you're feeling down will make you feel better. You know, I think there are some forms of activity that we call pleasure. I mean, some people find that when they're down, they go shopping. And that may be something we could unlearn. Yeah.
Do you know with the rate of population growth, is there a predicted year or general timeline when we'll reach that UN number of
What did you say, 10?
Yeah, whatever the
10 billion, I think they said 2050. Yeah. Yeah, 10 billion. And again, see, what Cohen points out in his book is you don't know what's going to happen in 2015 if something might happen that would change the conditions that that prediction was based on. That's why it's so difficult to make predictions. We do know, for example, one of the things that's troubling is that something like 25% of the Earth's population, maybe 30%, is under the age of 15, not in reproductive age yet. That will impose a ton of challenges for us as all of those people, you know, you got that population pyramid, and there's this 25% that haven't reached reproductive age. They also, in many countries, haven't tried to find a job yet. They're still in school. So it's going to be pretty challenging.